Committee on Natural Resources will come to order. I would begin by observing that while the horrific disaster which took place at the Upper Big Branch coal mine in my home county of Raleigh, West Virginia, has largely been swept from the national spotlight by the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon rig in the Gulf of Mexico, it continues to weigh heavily on the citizens of West Virginia and throughout the coal fields. Federal and state investigations are proceeding, and we in the Congress are developing a legislative response to ensure a more safe working environment for our nation's underground coal miners, brave and hard-working souls, every one of them. While the country continues to focus on the Gulf of Mexico and the impact that spill is having on so many businesses, on people, and the economy of that region, I do believe, and in fact I insist, that we as a nation continue to address the plight of the coal miner and the economy of coal field communities in the Appalachian region. And that is what we are doing this morning. Today, the committee is meeting for the consideration of H.R. 5479, the Coal Accountability and Retired Employee Act of 2010, or the CARE Act. This legislation keeps faith with an historic federal commitment made to the mine workers in 1946. At the time, with President Harry Truman looking on, Interior Secretary Julius Krug signed an agreement with UMWA President John L. Lewis, guaranteeing the health and welfare of the coal miner. The Krug-Lewis agreement was the very foundation for a welfare and retirement system established for the mine workers and their dependents. This federal guarantee to the mine workers also served as a basis for the 1992 Coal Act, in which, through my efforts, Congress authorized a transfer of interest accruing to the unspent balance of the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Fund for the purpose of providing solvency to UMWA's health care fund. At the time, because so many companies had escaped their responsibility under the National Bituminous Coal Wage Agreement, over 60% of the people who received their health care under the UMWA's program never worked for the coal operators who were making premium payments. This large orphaned miner population threatened to overwhelm the entire system. The 1992 legislation threw a lifeline to the health care fund for several years, but as more and more coal companies abrogated their responsibilities, Congress was compelled to act again in the 2006 amendments to the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Program, which provides transfers of general funds to ensure the solvency of the UMWA's 3 health care plans. The problems which plagued the UMWA health program in the past are now afflicting their pension plan. At present, well over half of the current retirees never worked for the coal companies currently participating in that plan. This situation, as well as the recent economic downturn, has placed the pension plan on the road to insolvency. At stake are the pensions of over 120,000 people, around 38,000 who reside in my home state of West Virginia, and the economic viability of the contributing coal companies. Think about that. These hard-working people who engaged in the noble but often dangerous occupation of mining coal for the energy security of this country now may find in their elderly years dilemma and confusion when it comes to the security of their pensions. I fought long, I fought hard, and I was relentless in my efforts to get these coal miners the health care they deserve, and I will not allow their pensions to be threatened. This matter has been the first thing on my mind when I wake up in the morning, and it is in my prayers every evening. The pending legislation would tap into these funds made available by the 2000 amendments to the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Program that are not necessary for any current law obligation, and transfer those amounts to the UMWA pension fund in order to ensure its solvency. I have spent a career standing up for our coal miners, their widows, and our coal field communities, whether it be black lung benefits, coal mine safety, or health care. And I will tell you this, I will fight for these individuals' pensions with every breath in my body. I would like to particularly thank UMWA President Cecil Roberts for being here this morning. He is the president of a union with a proud tradition, and one which has pioneered many things in the American workplace that we take for granted today, such as the 8-hour workday and collective bargaining rights. Cecil Roberts' every breath of air is devoted to what is just and good for our nation's coal miners across the coal fields and across this world. I commend him. I thank him for his expertise, for his professionalism, and most importantly for the friendship that he has bestowed upon this chairman and so many of us in the coal fields from whence he comes. Our second panelist this morning will be Mr. David Young, individual I've known for quite a while as well, president of the Bituminous Coal Operators Association, and an individual who knows coal and knows our coal field communities intimately as well. I now recognize the ranking member before we move on to the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I don't have an opening statement, and I intended to yield my time to Mrs. Lummis from Wyoming, and if we could do that when she arrives, I would appreciate that courtesy, but I have no opening statement myself.
The chair will recognize Ms. Lummis as soon as she arrives. And pending that, we'll move on with our panel. I've already introduced him, Mr. Cecil Roberts, President of the United Mine Workers of America, and Mr. David Young, President of Bituminous Coal Operators Association. Gentlemen, we do have your prepared testimony, and it will be made a part of the record as if actually read, and you may proceed as you desire. Cecil, you want to start?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for allowing the United Mine Workers to participate in this hearing today, and thank you for scheduling the hearing. Let me begin by thanking you not only for the hearing today, but the friendship that you and I have had for over 30 years now, and the efforts that you have made on behalf of coal miners, one of which was my dad, who we know passed away a couple years ago, and he died with dignity, had the best health care in the world. And one of the widows who receives a pension that we're going to talk about today happens to be my mother, who will be 91 here in a few weeks. So this is not only something that's an institutional question for us, this is a very personal situation for every member of United Mine Workers. In West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, wherever we're from, we all have someone who's drawing a pension, and we all have someone that has health care. We did an analysis in the last month, and about 152,000 Americans who live in the coal fields have health care. And I think they can look to you, Mr. Chairman, that over 100,000 of them have health care as a direct response to what you have done in this Congress. I still remember meeting with you in 1992 when you came up with the concept of using the interest money to help pay the health care benefits that were guaranteed, as you said, in 1946 in Harry Truman's White House. And I appreciate the fact that you've continued to fight not only for health care, but for the safety of all coal miners. And I just want to reiterate what you just said. Our hearts and prayers go out today to the 29 families from Upper Big Branch. While this was a non-union mine, I've said frequently that we all know one another in the coal fields. I was personal friends with some of these miners who passed away, and our prayers are with those miners, and we appreciate very much your hard work in trying to make the mines in this country safe. And for the black lung victims, we know over 100,000 miners have died from pneumoconiosis in this country, and you've been a champion to provide benefits and safer workplaces for those people. We come today, Mr. Chairman, it's somewhat ironic. The history of the coal fields has been one of conflict. If you go back to the early days, and quite frankly, and occasionally even today. But the problem we come today with is not of the making of the union. It's not the making of the coal industry. And it certainly wasn't something that the pensioners and the beneficiaries of this fund created. The fund that we're going to talk about here today, or we'll be talking about today, at the time of the signing of the last collective bargaining agreement, had over $6 billion in assets, and was about 94% funded. There's only one event, only one, that has occurred since the signing of this collective bargaining agreement to the present to change the funding status of this, and that was the recession that hit in 2008. It's ironic as we come here today that we've chosen and we respect decisions of Congress to bail out Wall Street. We see the CEOs that made the decisions that led to the financial downfall of our economy now getting bonuses. I don't fault them for that. But the decisions that they made have adversely affected a lot of people in this country. And I find it very tragic that it's affecting hardworking coal miners. It's adversely affecting, or could adversely affect, people who are in their 90s. Some people in this fund are as old as 100 years old. A few years ago, we did an analysis of this fund and found that the oldest beneficiary was 112. Unfortunately, that lady has passed away since we did that analysis, but I could say to you today, we did another analysis, we'll find someone in this fund that's at least 100 years of age. I think that people depend greatly. In fact, I know they depend greatly on these pension checks. I want to point out to the committee that in the last 10 years, $6 billion has been paid to retirees or their widows, most of this in Appalachia. The states that receive the most from this are states, I think West Virginia is first, I think Pennsylvania is second, I believe Kentucky is third, and I believe Virginia is fourth. A lot of hand loading went on in the old days in these areas. At one time, coal mining was very labor intensive, and that's not the case now. It's highly mechanized, long walls, producing lots and lots of coal with very few people. So today we come and as the Pension Protection Act tells us, we've got to do certain things, and one of which would be to increase funding to this plan and ask the coal industry that did nothing wrong to pay as much as $20 an hour into this fund, which would bankrupt some of them, put people out of work, and perhaps lead to total collapse of this fund. The other thing is eventually you get around to the possibility of reducing benefits. I've got to tell you what I've told our members. I'm not going to be a person who supports the cutting the benefits for people who've earned them. These people have given their lives to this industry. We've all benefited from this. All of us. 50% of the electricity in this country comes from coal. Our economy's been fueled off the backs of these coal miners who are now retired and their widows who are now surviving. And I think this nation made a promise to these people, and this promise should be kept. And I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Cecil. I will have some questions, but per the request of the ranking member, and before going to you, Dave, I would like to recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming. Sorry I didn't warn you.
Thank you very much.
For any
Mr.
comments,
Chairman.
opening statement you'd like to make.
I so appreciate this opportunity and want to welcome our panel this morning as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Hastings, for yielding to me. The nation's leader in coal is Wyoming, and we have a vested interest in the fate of the AML program. Since AML's creation in 1977, Wyoming has worked diligently to reclaim mining sites on over 32,000 acres. This work was done despite the federal government's failure to distribute AML funds to the states as required by law. Finally, under the bipartisan leadership of the chairman of this committee and others, a bipartisan agreement was reached in 2006 that finally granted Wyoming, West Virginia, and other states what the federal government had co-opted for nearly 30 years. Chairman Rahal's understanding of this complicated history of AML has resulted in the carefully crafted legislation under consideration by the committee today. As currently written and absent other interference, it appears the legislation would have no effect on the historic agreement reached in 2006 on certified states and tribes. I commend the chairman for his artful drafting of this bill. Having said that, I have two concerns that I sincerely hope the chairman will consider. There were many, including the chairman himself, I would suspect, who hoped that following passage of the 2006 agreement, this issue had finally been put to rest for the good of everyone involved. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. The program has continued to be the target of those who do not understand the promises made and broken by the federal government throughout the history of AML. The sharks continue to circle, Mr. Chairman, and I am deeply concerned that passage of this legislation will give opponents the opening they've been seeking. On a more philosophical level, the intent of the legislation under consideration helps to highlight what is a very troubling trend. From so-called agency guidance to coal ash, to permit suspensions and delays, to Clean Air and Water Act revisions and more, the Obama administration has worked overtime to hinder domestic coal production. The only possible outcome of these policies is a crippled industry unable to hire new workers of any kind. Again, I have great respect for the chairman of this committee. His leadership on the AML program is undisputed. I understand his desire to shore up a failing pension plan for coal miners. However, if we were truly concerned about the fate of America's hardworking coal miners, we would also be working night and day to beat back the onslaught from an administration hell-bent on halting coal production altogether. I look forward to working with the chairman on all of these issues in the weeks ahead. And Mr. Chairman, thankfully again for the opportunity to present my statement, I yield back.
Let's proceed with our panel. I've already introduced Mr. Dave Young. Dave.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I am pleased to be here this morning to testify a matter of critical importance to the organized coal industry. As president of the Bituminous Coal Operators Association, the BCOA represents its member companies in collective bargaining with negotiations for the National Bituminous Coal Wage Agreement with the United Mine Workers of America. The BCOA is also the management settlor of the UMWA 1974 pension plan, a multi-employer pension plan created by the National Bituminous Coal Wage Agreement. I'm here today to testify in support of H.R. 5479, the Coal Accountability and Retired Employee Act of 2010. H.R. 5479 would make available funds generated by the provisions of the Surface Mining Act of 2006 to the 1974 plan to offset funding needed for the losses caused by the 2008 market collapse. This legislation is necessary to protect the pensions of the 1974 pension plan beneficiaries and to avoid either a plan insolvency or plan termination under Title IV of ERISA. Prior to the 2000 market collapse, as referenced by President Roberts earlier, the plan was 94% funded on a clear path to full funding. However, the combination of the 2008 market decline on plan net assets and the plan being in a peak cash flow years today that require nearly $700 million annually to meet pension benefit obligations means that the restoration of prior funding levels really is no longer realistic today. The root cause of the plan's difficulty has been a persistent decline in the number of contributing employers really since the 1970s, which in a large part reflects the shift in coal production from east to west in response to governmental environmental policy at that time. The result is that today the 1974 plan is nearly 12 to 1, a ratio of retirees to active miners. This imbalance clearly creates a crushing financial burden for the remaining contributing employers. The result is today a last man's club of only 10 employer groups supporting the pension benefits of over 110,000 retirees. Yet the signatory contributing employers of these groups only employ 10,000 representative active miners themselves. I should note that about one-third or 33,000 of the pension beneficiaries, as we've discussed, are really widows of retired miners. And nearly 10,000 of these retirees are totally disabled miners. Passage of 5479 will allow these remaining signatory employers to continue funding pension benefits for all of their current and former employees. and at the same time help to protect the 66,000, in our estimate, retired orphan miners whose employers are no longer in the coal business for various reasons. The companies that currently contribute to the 74 pension plan are the last line of defense for the plan and stand in the shoes of the government when it comes to funding the pension benefits of those orphan miners, who, on the other circumstances, would already be the responsibility of the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. As an example, Bethlehem Steel entered bankruptcy a few years ago. Employees of the steel company became the responsibility of the PBGC. However, miners who retired from Bethlehem Steel at the same time remained in the 1974 plan, and their full benefits guaranteed and funded by the remaining contributors to the 74 pension plan. Mr. Chairman, as you know, the government has been deeply involved in the coal industry and with these plans since the 1940s. Indeed, the mines were seized, unbelievably, in 1946 with the express purpose of establishing this pension program. The pension benefits did not start until the Speaker of the House, Joseph Martin, in 1948 met with the fund trustees and effected the appointment of Senator Stiles Bridges as a neutral trustee. Senator Bridges then sided with John L. Lewis, the UMWA president and trustee, in agreeing to a pay-as-you-go funding structure and setting the retirement age, length of service requirements that are still the core of today's benefit program. Together, all of us, the miners, the companies, and the government, have made a great deal of difference in the lives of people in the coal fields and for our energy needs. Today, we are once again at a juncture when the historic promise to these miners is in jeopardy. We believe that H.R. 5479 recognizes this stark fact and provides the best way to correct it. Thank you for this opportunity to support and protect the livelihood of the nation's retired coal miners.
Thank you, gentlemen, both for your compelling testimony and the manner in which you presented it. Let me start by asking both of you about the types of pensions involved. We're not talking about gold-plated pensions, as we're all aware. President Roberts, you said the average pension for a surviving spouse, for example, is only $304 a month. So basically, these women are getting along with their UMWA pension care, their pension, the UMWA health care, their pension, Social Security. Is that correct? That's what they're asked to do?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
That's what they're asked to live on these days and face rising costs of everything.
That's correct.
Confronts us. Let's discuss the orphan population for a moment. President Roberts, you stated that pension benefits are provided to 97,500 retired and disabled miners, and nearly 54% of the planned population is composed of people whose employer no longer contributes to the plan. If you add in active participants and terminated vested participants, the total population is slightly over 120,000, with about 60% of them being orphans. Could you please explain a little bit more in detail how this large orphan population came about?
Yeah, I believe I can, Mr. Chairman. If you go to what Mr. Young said about Bethlehem, at one time, we know Bethlehem was one of the largest corporations in America. Had, at one time, I think, 120,000 employees. Many people may not realize this, but Bethlehem owned many coal mines in Pennsylvania and West Virginia in particular. In fact, my dad's last employer was Beth Energy, which was a subsidiary of Bethlehem Steel. But we know what happened with Bethlehem. They went into bankruptcy. And one of the things that's happened here, as opposed to the federal government picking up the pensions of the Beth Energy workers, we have, between negotiations between the Bituminous Coal Operators Association and the union, continued to provide those benefits. Now, the employees of Bethlehem Steel, the retirees, the government has been subsidizing those pensions through the Public Benefit Guarantee Corporation under ERISA. So we have tried, and we have been successful in the coal industry to make sure the government never has not had to do that. Now, it's not just Bethlehem Steel that went into bankruptcy over the years. If you go back and read the history of coal production in this country, I'll take you quickly through this. In the 30s, the UMWA was the largest union in the country because coal was mined by hand with a shovel, very labor intensive. I'd like to go back to those employment numbers. I don't know if we want to go back to loading coal again by hand, but as time went on, we had a mechanization period in the late 40s, early 50s, and we went from like 800 and some thousand workers down to like 300,000. And then as time went on, became more and more mechanized. However, we've also gone through many, many bankruptcies and employers walking away from this industry. You will not find, that I'm aware of, one single UMWA retiree being paid for by PBGC right now, unless you, I think the anthracite miners might have, a handful of those might have fallen into that category, but the two parties sitting here have been responsible and negotiated agreements that allowed for the payment of pensions to continue for those people who work for companies that are gone. They're not there for us to deal with. The union can't go and bargain with those people. They don't exist anymore. But the two parties sitting here have continued to see that those benefits arrive at the door every single month. And there's about 100,000 people, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that go to the post office or go out by the gate and reach in there and get a check that they depend on very heavily. And $6 billion in the last 10 years. You talk about economic stimulus plan. That's a pretty darn good one down in southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky and Appalachia. And by the way, every state in the union, all 50 states, have pensioners that receive benefits.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I follow up on
Sure,
that, please?
sure, Dave.
I think I can relate from my own experience in a prior life before coming to Washington about 11 years ago. I was in the coal industry about 20 years and spent time in Appalachia and Indiana and Illinois and Kentucky as well. Part of my experience was in Illinois in the early 90s. I was there and worked for Old Bend Coal at the time. We had a great operation there. We had 4 longwall mines and a couple CM mines and super people working for us. And along came the Clean Air Act. And we saw a lot of coal that moved from east to west to the benefit of the Powder River Basin, strictly due to sulfur. I was selling coal at the time for $13 a ton, and you can't buy much for $13 when you get 2,000 pounds of anything, let alone coal. And we couldn't find a market for that product. And unfortunately, I mean, the government has created part of this problem with the reduction in manpower in the companies that have gone bankrupt or have gone out of the business during this time period, most of whom would have been organized in the East. And I can relate personally at that time, friends of mine, people that I grew to know in Illinois, I shut down 4 longwall mines doing a fabulous job, safe, efficient operations, and 2,000 people went home, and I'm not sure any of them have worked a day since the early 90s. And that's just one example, sir. I mean, there are so many out there that would break your heart sometimes. But we did a good job, and for various reasons, Clean Air Act, we've gone to lower sulfur coal, and we see a lot of effects by climate, and we have a lot of unknowns even going today. Where we're going to go in the coal industry today. So we need a policy, as you know, and I'm sure you're going to help us get there. Thank you.
Very good observation, Dave. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, who has 72 UMWA pensioners in his district.
I'm glad to know that. I don't know 72 of them. I'll tell you.
We'll get you the names and address.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield whatever time I have to Mrs. Lummis if she has any questions.
The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized, who has 91 UMWA pensioners in her district.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be delighted to have their names and addresses. Yeah, you both have tremendous experience in the coal industry and a lifelong effort to see some of these changes through. And so my question is this. The 2000 changes to SMACRA were important. Excuse me, the 2006 changes, yeah, the negotiation. How long did it take to negotiate the changes with all these interested parties? I know it was a Herculean effort.
Let me be the first to try to speak to that. By the way, I should inform you that the first person to receive a pension check from this fund in 1946 was from Wyoming. So that's a little historic note here today. And let me also, if I may, thank the leadership in Wyoming, the governor, the people that were here from Congress at the time, never ever tried to prevent the passage of this act without taking care of these pensioners' health care. And although there were very few people in Wyoming who were receiving these benefits, the people in Wyoming understood that we can't walk away from these. And I want to thank you and everyone that was in a leadership position in Wyoming and continues today for that. This, I know this went on for years. I'm guessing at a minimum 4 years, but it might have been more. The chairman could tell you, he's doing the multiplication with his hands up there. But when we were struggling from 92 forward with respect to trying to determine how to take care of these health care benefits until we finally passed the 06 legislation, there was conversations about this all through that period. I think it's the best way to answer it.
Let me comment. I was heavily involved. I came to town in 1999, which is close to the chairman's 10 fingers he put up there. And it was an issue at that time. It was there before I arrived. And it was number one on our list. And I also kind of woke up every morning praying about this orphan health care issue. Yeah. So it really came together when we worked with all the states and we saw the value of the AML process and the issues that were needed in all areas. And with that, I think it unified us as a group that we were able to solve the problem.
Well, it's to all of your credit that it was solved, and I deeply appreciated it as well. Question for Mr. Roberts. Do you support the President's proposed changes to SMACRA? And I'm talking now about the distributions in the President's 2011 budget.
Excuse me, could you be a little more specific about what we're talking about?
It has to do with the manner in which monies are distributed to exclude certified states.
I think the answer to that is that we don't support that. I must apologize that I'm not as up to date on that as you are, but I don't think the mine workers are on record supporting. In fact, I believe we oppose that.
Thank you. And one more question. Are you concerned that the rewrite of the stream buffer zone rule and other actions by the administration will adversely impact both coal mining companies and their employees, some of whom are union members?
Yes, we have about, for your information, about 1,000 UMWA members in southern West Virginia doing this type work. We've worked with the industry with respect to that. We are concerned about that. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman, those are all the questions I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman from New Jersey who has West Virginia in his blood is recognized and who also has 54 UMWA pensioners in his district.
Well, I don't represent the entire state of New Jersey, but there certainly are some in New Jersey and, of course, many friends and acquaintances in West Virginia that I have. But more to the point, President Roberts, you make in your testimony, you state that a promise was made to the nation's coal miners in the White House long ago in 1946. I'd like to draw attention to that. It's It is not how many members of the UMW are in each person's district. It is, are we going to make good on our national promise, our national obligation? The miners have held up their end in difficult times, in difficult circumstances, while the energy market has changed underneath them. We have to do our best to hold up our national obligation here. And I think the chairman has done a fine job with this. Let me ask Mr. Roberts to put this in perspective and the declining prospects for the pension fund. How does this compare with other pension funds? There's trouble all over. I guess I'd like to establish for the record that this isn't an example of individual mismanagement.
I thank you for that question. I think you're making a very good point, Congressman. By the way, thank you for the kind remarks about the government keeping the promises it makes. Because once the government starts breaking promises, I think people start losing faith in their government. But we just did a presentation throughout the country at 4 different conferences. In 2008, when this fund saw the dramatic decline of over $3.5 billion in assets, because no one did a thing wrong here. This fund was 92 to 94% funded. We increased the contributions we asked the industry to make, and those were significant amounts. The contribution rate went from almost $0 to $5.50 for every hour people worked when we did the last bargaining. We acted responsibly, but the industry, the union, did nothing wrong here. Certainly the pensioners did nothing wrong. The beneficiaries did nothing wrong. But we saw this collapse in 2008 because of the mismanagement on Wall Street, and I commend the Congress for trying to deal with that problem also. But to answer your question specifically, we have a chart that where almost every pension plan in the United States had this happen to them. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned here that I think would be helpful to the committee, many of these plans will have an opportunity to recover 10 years, 15, whatever it may take. What is significantly problematic here with this particular pension plan, we are at our peak for paying out benefits. We're paying out $660 some million a year now, which is the highest amount we've ever had to pay out in any particular year, and we anticipate that being higher as time goes on for a period of time. At the same time, we've seen our assets dramatically reduced because of the recession. The problem is obvious here is with the responsibility to pay these benefits, you may not have the time for this fund to recover, like some plans may have that opportunity, but this fund will not.
Thank you.
Congress, could I add to that also?
Yes, Mr. Young.
The one unique item, I think, of our 74 pension fund that I've not heard from any other industry or area that I'm aware is our 12-to-1 ratio of all the retirees that we have out there, which have certainly paid their way and done their bit to get there. And now we're down to, as our organized industry is shrinking, the ratio of active people to try to fund those people. We had cash in the bank. We had $6.7 billion at one point in time in the bank to make these payments. They've disappeared. And as President Roberts said, with the ratio of what few active people we have working for that 100,000 retirees, we just don't have time, as some other industries do. We're going to be forced by the PPA to come up with a huge funding hourly rate here, which is very difficult for someone to look at a $18, $20 rate per hour for pensions, let alone the hourly rate. The cold economics in the marketplace today will not pay for that.
Well, thank you. In the time that I don't have remaining, I will just say that I appreciate the chairman's undertaking this. The worst that can be said about this legislation is, I think, it might not work to put the pension fund back on sound footing, but for the sake of the miners, we have to try. Thank you.
Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman. Oh, I'm sorry, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, my questions have been answered, so I would yield back.
Let me finish asking my questions then. In the 74 plan, if the 74 plan is certified as endangered or critical later this year under the PBG, under the Pension Protection Act of '06, funding improvement plans will have to be adopted. President Roberts, in your testimony, you note that under these circumstances, company contribution rates may have to rise from $5 an hour to $20 an hour. What other adjustments would have to be made?
This is some new ground we're all plowing here with this 2006 Act, Mr. Chairman, and I've spent more time than I care to talk about with lawyers who are experts in this field who at any given time will say, well, we really don't know what you're supposed to do if A or B happens. But you have a classification of endangered, you have a classification of seriously endangered, then the third classification is critical. Obviously, when you get to critical, that's the most severe declaration that could be made under this act. And as I understand it, the IRS and the Department of Labor jointly have responsibilities for enforcing this provision. It requires us to come up with within 200 and some, it's a little less than a year. They give you about a little less than a year to come up with a funding mechanism to get out of the endangered or in seriously endangered or in critical. Critical, if you get to that stage, not only would it mandate additional funding, but adjustment in benefits. And then obviously, it's the same thing with seriously endangered, too. Here's the thing I think we might be missing here, and I think it needs to be said. Would $20 an hour, if the industry agreed to pay it, fix this problem? I fear it might make it worse. I think we're going to have fewer employers that will be standing in line to pay this. I think what they may do is attempt to withdraw from this fund, which they can do under the 74 Act, but that will create the biggest legal fight. Perhaps I should point out that the collective bargaining agreement itself expires at the end of next year. A union's not in the business of saying, well, let's cut our people's benefits. And of course, the industry would tell me they're not in the business of going out of business. So I think it's setting the stage here for a horrendous conflict between the union and the BCOA that we didn't create. Now, we found lots of things to fight about. We're pretty good at that. But we didn't ask for this one to fight over. So what will have to happen, we'll have to establish a plan. The BCOA and the union are required to do this under this act. And I guess someone in the government, either at the IRS or the Department of Labor, it's a little bit unclear to me who makes these decisions at what level, will either approve or disapprove this plan. But I think actually the actuaries that you have working for the 74 plan are supposed to approve or disapprove this funding mechanism to get the plan back under what they would call, I guess, solvency as we move forward. But it seems to me like we will be given an almost impossible task here.
And let me ask you, worst case scenario, in the 74 plan is completely insolvent and the PBGC takes over.
That would be.
What can the retirees expect?
Well, here's what happens. That's even over and above the Pension Protection Act. The Pension Protection Act was designed, I think Congress had good intentions there, and I respect that. But I think the Pension Protection Act was geared so no one ever goes into the PBGC, quite frankly. But I think they may have also inadvertently created a situation where PBGC will end up taking over some of these plans. If PBGC takes over, we all understand that they say they guarantee pensions, but they only guarantee them at a certain level. We've done somewhat of an analysis here, and I think people would, in some instances, be getting about half of what they're getting now if the PBGC stepped in. Now, this is a failure of the Pension Protection Act to do what it's supposed to do, this would be a failure of the union and the co-operators from being able to figure this out in negotiations. PBGC is now stepping in to say, we're going to take over. At that point in time, people do not get the benefit level that they were entitled to. So people that you referred to as not having a gold-plated pension would be getting less than they are now if we ever got to that stage. But I'm committed, and I've told our members this, that I'm committed to keep that from happening.
Let me follow up with that, Mr. Chairman. Also, we've also made a kind of a quick look at how the beneficiaries could be affected if the PBGC were to force to take over here and our funding base fails for whatever reason. Unbelievable to me that someone who's receiving, is going to be an elderly lady probably. We're talking about widows here again, who was receiving a check for $304 a month. We think that individual would see about a 10% cut in that check, if you can believe that, down to about $270, and it just progressively increases. So, the more money you're entitled to in your package, the more the PBGC makes a cut. So our estimate would be everyone would receive at a minimum of 10% cut. Some could see as high as a 40% cut in their retirement.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you both for your testimony today. We appreciate it. Committee will now hear from Mr. Alfred Whitehouse, the Chief of the Division of Reclamation Support, Office of Surface Mining Reclamation Enforcement. Nice to have you, Mr. Whitehouse, before the committee. Good to see you again. And we do have your prepared testimony, and it will be made part of the record as if actually read. You may proceed as you wish.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement on H.R. 5479, the Coal Accountability and Retired Employee Act of 2010. H.R. 5479 would require that the unused portion of the U.S. Treasury funds below the annual cap of $490 million established by the 2006 amendments to the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act be paid each year to the trustees of the 1974 United Mine Workers of America Pension Plan. While we recognize the importance of ensuring that retired miners receive their pensions, we have serious concerns with this bill. SMACRA established OSM for two basic purposes. First, to ensure that the nation's coal mines operate in a manner that protects citizens and the environment during mining operations and restores the land to beneficial use after mining. Second, to implement an abandoned mine land program to address the hazards and environmental damage created by centuries of weakly regulated coal mining that occurred before SMACRA's enactment. The AML program is funded by a fee assessed on each ton of coal produced and deposited in the Abandoned Mine Land Reclamation Fund. Historically, Congress appropriated far less money from the Abandoned Mine Land Fund than the total fees collected, which allowed the fund to grow. Beginning in fiscal year 1996, an amount equal to the interest earned by the AML fund, but capped at $70 million, has been available for transfer to the United Mine Workers of America Combined Benefit Fund. This was to defray the cost of providing health care benefits to certain retired coal miners and their dependents. Congress amended SMACRA as part of the Tax Relief and Health Care Act of 2006. The amendments removed the $70 million cap and added funding for two additional UMWA health care plans. After 2006 amendments, OSM became responsible for transferring an annual amount to the three UMWA health care plans based on estimated expenses. Any shortfall between the interest earned by OSM and the amount of the transfer estimated by health care plan trustees would be funded from the U.S. Treasury's General Fund. Under Title IV of SMACRA, OSM expended $336 million from the General Treasury Fund in FY 2010. Approximately $227 million was distributed through AML grants to states and tribes, and approximately $108 million was transferred to the 3 healthcare plans. H.R. 5479 would require an amount representing the difference between the SMACRA transfer from the Treasury General Fund and the $490 million cap to be transferred to the 1974 pension plan every fiscal year. As a result, this bill would significantly increase expenditures from the Treasury under SMACRA and would eliminate all of the savings to be achieved through reductions proposed in the President's fiscal year 2011 budget. For example, the President's FY 2011 budget proposes to eliminate abandoned mine land payments to states and tribes that have been certified as completing reclamation of their high-priority abandoned mine land coal problems. Under the budget proposal, the eliminated payments would remain in the Treasury. However, H.R. 5479 would require that the full amount of the cap on the SMACRA Treasury allocations be spent every year, eliminating any savings. The administration takes seriously the financial problems facing many multi-employer pension plans, including those sponsored by the United Mine Workers of America, and is committed to working with Congress to find solutions that address the long-term solvency of these plans and protect the retirement security of workers and their beneficiaries. However, we have serious concerns that H.R. 5479, if enacted, would add significant new costs and eliminate any savings sought by the administration's 2011 budget. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before the committee today and testify on the bill. I look forward to working with the committee to ensure the nation's abandoned mine lands are reclaimed.
Thank you, Mr. Whitehouse. I realize fully, and we've seen this many times in this city, that you are, I guess, what we call the proverbial sacrificial lamb at this hearing. And you've been directed by OMB what to say about the pending measure, and sure, you'd like to use this money to make the deficit look smaller. That's commonplace. But I would point out 2 things with respect to your testimony. First, as I'm sure you are aware, there would be no AML program today if it were not for this gentleman sitting in this chair. I almost single-handedly, against utility and coal industry opposition, extended the program in the late 80s, and then again in 92, and played a major role in the 06 extension. I say this because I know there are people within your agency who simply do not like to be put in the position of managing funds for the purpose of mine workers' health care plan. Pure and simple. And I believe that sentiment is coming out today with respect to the pending legislation. And second, as you heard me question President Cecil Roberts, if the 74 plan goes under, then the PGC takes over, and guess who foots the bill? The taxpayers, the American taxpayers. And that's fact. So I'm not going to grill you this morning or ask you any questions on your heartless testimony, but I realize the position you've been put in, and I guess I'll let it go at that. You will too, huh?
Thank you very much.
Okay, that's fine with the gentle lady from Virgin Islands. Thank you.
Thank you.
No further business. Committee stands adjourned.